Eating poison and putting animals on trial just doesn't sound real. But times were quite different during the medieval era, and these are just some of the most brutal practices that actually existed hundreds of years ago. First on our list is body snatching. Having a job as a grave robber probably wouldn't look too good on a modern day resume, but back in the medieval era, these people made quite a good living and built up solid connections with local clinics. See, many years ago when autopsies were slowly becoming a thing, coroners were actively trying to learn what caused a particular person to pass away. The only issue for them was that many people buried their loved ones straight away, as they strongly believed in the resurrection of the corpse. This made it hard for coroners to obtain any new subjects for their studies, and this is where body snatchers really came into play. These grave robbers would usually arrive in the middle of the night and dig holes in graveyards to pull out the bodies. They would then carefully transport the bodies to the coroners, who would then pay them for their gruesome and horrifying work. It definitely wasn't legal back in the day either, but some people actually made a solid living off of this creepy practice. Next up is the anti-blasphemy law. Speak out against religion and lose your tongue. That is pretty much the exact warning that many citizens received in the medieval ages. Religion was the dominant factor in society hundreds of years ago, so anyone that did not agree with it was going to be in for a very rough ride. Nowadays you have the freedom to believe in whatever you want, but things just weren't so simple back in the day. Blasphemy was the act of speaking ill about God or any other religious figures, and the punishment for this crime was incredibly serious. Many people would see you as a servant of the devil for spreading evil information, so the ruling powers decided that it was appropriate to take away your ability to speak. Anyone who was caught spreading anti-religious information would have a large portion of their tongue removed to ensure they could never speak poorly about God again. Authorities decided this was the best way to keep everyone in check, even if it was a terribly gruesome punishment. Now we have tattoo punishments. They might be seen as trendy artwork today, but tattoos had a totally different meaning for a lot of people in the medieval era. This was actually a form of punishment for anyone who decided to be unfaithful and commit the crime of adultery. Anyone who was caught red-handed in the act of infidelity would usually receive a letter A tattooed on a very visible body part. This was often placed on the forehead so everyone knew exactly what you did, and you'd be forced to live with never-ending shame. On top of the embarrassing mark, the process of obtaining a tattoo was far more painful back in the day. Instead of traditional needles, punishers would generally use animal teeth and unsafe ink that could lead to poisonous infections. So not only would you need to live with an embarrassing tattoo for the rest of your life, you would also have to endure some excruciating pain in the process. After that, we have leech therapy. When doctors in the medieval ages couldn't come up with any cures, they turned to wildlife for a helping hand. There's a lot of weird ways that people try to deal with infections in the medieval era, but this might be the strangest of them all. In this scenario, we are talking about leeches and how they were used to literally extract diseases from a person's body. These nasty little creatures would be used to suck the blood out of a patient to try and extract any infected cells. Of course, these creatures were incredibly dangerous as they could also carry deadly diseases themselves. This method probably worked from time to time, but it would usually lead to a host of new infections on many occasions. But as dangerous as this was, it was still an incredibly popular treatment amongst doctors. Many peasants were even taking on jobs as leech collectors so they could sell the creatures to their local doctors for a very pretty penny. Next on our list are the animal trials. Yep, there was a time when animals would have to face a judge as a direct result of their so-called crimes. That probably sounds pretty ridiculous when you first hear it, and that's because it is. Many animals during the medieval era would actually be put on trial if they were caught in the act of a crime. They would have to go through the same ordeal as any human criminal, except they obviously couldn't speak any human dialect. This would have made it impossible for any animal to defend itself, so a lot of these creatures were actually handed serious punishments. Petty crimes such as theft might land them in a prison cell for a couple of days, more serious crimes could result in capital punishment. This would usually be reserved for large animals and predators who might have taken a person's life, and they would more than likely end up in the same place as a human who committed the same crime. It was a completely ridiculous practice that lasted all the way into the 18th century before it was finally abolished. Up next we have Coffin Bells. This is by far one of the strangest inventions of all time, but sadly it was necessary in this time period. The Black Plague was absolutely decimating the European population during the medieval era. About 30 to 50% of the entire European population was completely wiped out by this deadly pandemic, and doctors just couldn't keep up with all the infected patients. Times were so tough that many people were being placed in coffins before anyone actually confirmed that they had in fact expired. It was so bad that some people were being buried alive and had no way of escaping. This is why the coffin bell was first invented. If anyone had been mistakenly placed into a coffin and buried in the dirt, they could pull a small string inside the coffin that would ring a bell to alert the authorities that they were still alive. Thankfully, there is no need for this in today's day and age, but it was truly a terrifying sign of the times in the medieval ages. After that, we have toxic food. Why anyone would willingly eat poison is a complete and total mystery. This actually happened in the medieval era. It seems like health was placed on the back burner in this scenario, where people were far more interested in eating attractive food than healthy food. Now, you could technically say this still goes on today, but people in the medieval era were really taking this to the extreme. Certain chefs and bakers found that adding poisonous substances like mercury to their food created very colorful results. Various food items such as jams and biscuits would have a hint of colorful substances, and these displays would attract buyers into the shop. Maybe it tasted the same as a regular biscuit, but the substances were doing far more harm than good. Many people who ate these poisonous foods would obviously fall very ill, but that didn't seem to stop people from buying them. Thankfully though, the toxic baked goods industry was left in the past. Now we move on to cannibalistic potions. Yeah, it turns out it can get far worse than poisonous foods. Some high-end doctors from the medieval era claimed to have magical elixirs that could fight off deadly diseases and prolong a person's lifespan. Life expectancy in the medieval era was obviously much worse than it is today, so people were desperate to find ways to stay alive. One of these methods was a special type of potion that actually contained human remains. Some people actually believed that these cannibalistic potions had divine healing powers that could fend off disease like the Black Plague and add a few more years onto your life. They were apparently extremely expensive to ensure that only nobles and royalty could afford these so-called magic drinks. Whether or not these potions had any sort of healing powers is a total mystery, but it's pretty obvious why these do not exist in today's world. Up next we have Sin Eaters. This is not a creepy monster from a video game, it was an actual profession that existed hundreds of years ago. In certain cases when a person would pass away, families of the deceased would hire Sin Eaters to enjoy a meal at their home. That doesn't sound all that bad at first until you realize that the dinner table is actually the chest of the deceased family member. Yes, as terrifying as that sounds, many people were convinced that this practice was necessary for the afterlife. Some people believe that the food would absorb any sins that the deceased had committed during their lifetime. This would boost their chances of getting into heaven. The only catch was that the person eating the meal would then absorb the sins and take them on as their own. This would also mean that the sin eater themselves would have to repeat the practice once they had passed away if they wanted any chance of getting into heaven. And finally we have flagellation. It turns out that whipping yourself with a belt was not an effective method for preventing the Black Plague. We already know that people were trying anything to cure the Black Plague, but this one just doesn't make any sense at all. Many believe that stale air could actually cause the infection to spread, so people would often ring loud bells and shoot firearms to try and break up the air with noise. Others would try bathing in rosewater and consuming special herbs, but the weirdest of the bunch was a practice known as flagellation. Many Christians believed that God had summoned the Black Plague to punish humans for all of their sins. So the idea that some people came up with was to whip themselves with leather straps that were covered in metal studs. They believed if they did this in public, they would repent themselves of their sins and avoid contracting the plague. It obviously didn't work and just ended up being a humiliating public display. And that covers our look at the 10 brutal medieval practices that will give you the chills. We hope you enjoyed this terrifying list, and we'll see you all for the next one. Eating poison and putting animals on trial just doesn't sound real. It's a terribly gruesome punishment. Now we have tattoo punishments. We hope you enjoyed this terrifying list, and we'll see you all for the next one.